I thought we were going on a weekend trip. I had packed a small bag, made a thermos of coffee, and climbed into the passenger seat of Daniel's car with the particular lightness of someone who has been looking forward to something for a long time. And I had been, genuinely. 2 years of asking. 2 years of him saying soon, just a few more weeks when this project wraps up. And then one Thursday evening in June, he came home, set his keys on the kitchen counter, and said, "Let's do it. This weekend. I'll drive us out to the countryside." I remember the warmth I felt. I remember thinking, see? He does hear me. He just needs time. I had no idea that the trip he had planned bore no resemblance to the trip I was imagining, and that 4 hours later he would stop the car at the edge of a village I had never heard of, beside a crumbling old house with broken shutters and a front yard swallowed by weeds, and tell me, quietly without meeting my eyes, that he wasn't staying. He wasn't staying. That was the phrase he used. Not "I'm leaving you," not "this is over." Just, "I'm not staying, Clara. I have things to deal with in the city. You should take some time here." And before I could process a single word of that, before I could ask what things, what time, what the hell he was talking about, he had pulled my bag from the back seat, placed it on the overgrown path in front of that house, and gotten back into the car. I stood there in the June heat, bag at my feet, watching the back of his head through the windshield as he made a slow, deliberate 3-point turn on the narrow village road. He did not look at me. Not once. Not in the side mirror. Not through the rear view. He simply drove away, and the sound of his engine faded until the only thing I could hear was the wind moving through the tall grass and the distant bark of a dog somewhere further down the road. What I did not know yet, what I would only discover 2 hours later when I finally stopped standing in that yard and went inside the house to find shelter from the sun, was that there was a folder sitting on the kitchen table. A manila folder, slightly dusty, with my name written on it in Eleanor's handwriting, not Daniel's, hers. And inside that folder was a document I had never seen, signed in 3 places where my signature had been forged with the kind of careful precision that takes practice, transferring my legal interest in our apartment, the apartment I had contributed 8 years of savings to purchase, to Eleanor Marsh, dated 4 months prior, notarized, apparently legitimate. That was the day I understood that I had not been taken on a trip. I had been removed. My name is Clara Holt Marsh. I was 34 years old when this happened, a landscape architect with a firm in the city, a woman who had spent 6 years building what she genuinely believed was a good life. I was not naive. I want to be clear about that. I was not a woman who went through the world with her eyes closed, who ignored red flags out of romantic fantasy or willful blindness. I was practical, observant. My profession had trained me to look at a space and understand its structure. What was load-bearing, what was decorative, what looked solid but was actually hollow at its core. The problem was that I had applied this skill to every part of my life, except my marriage. And perhaps that is its own kind of willful blindness. Perhaps when we love someone, we grant them an exemption from our most honest scrutiny. I had granted Daniel that exemption for 6 years, and he had used every single day of it. Daniel Marsh was 38, a residential architect, and he had the particular charm of men who are good-looking without being aware of it, which, in retrospect, should have told me something, because no one like that is actually unaware of it. They're just strategic about when to deploy it. We had met at a professional conference, found ourselves standing next to each other at a panel on sustainable urban design, and spent the remainder of the afternoon talking in the way that feels, in memory, like the beginning of a film. He was thoughtful. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered what I said from one sentence to the next. I had loved him for exactly those qualities, the qualities that make a person feel genuinely seen. And I would spend a long time after all of this wondering whether those qualities had ever been real, or whether they, too, had been strategic. We had bought our apartment 4 years into the marriage. The deposit had come largely from my savings. Daniel had been between projects, a dry spell that lasted almost a year, and I had the money and I loved him, and it had not felt like a sacrifice at the time. It had felt like partnership. We put both our names on the deed, which was right, which was fair, and I had not thought about it since because there had seemed no reason to. It was our home. That was all it was. Eleanor, his mother, had always been a presence I navigated rather than welcomed. She was 63, silver-haired, immaculate in the way that speaks not of vanity but of discipline. Pearl earrings every day, clothes pressed, posture straight, voice calibrated to a register of permanent authority. She was not overtly unkind to me. That is the thing I need to convey, because it matters to understanding how long it took me to see her clearly. She was never cruel in ways that were easy to name. She made comments, yes, small ones, spaced carefully apart, that could always be dismissed as misunderstanding or awkward phrasing. She once asked, while we were washing up after a Sunday dinner, whether I found my work fulfilling now, phrasing the question with a particular emphasis on now that carried the clear implication of, before you have children and must give it up. She once told Daniel, within my earshot, that Clara is very independent, as though independence in a wife were a mild but manageable medical condition. She referred to our apartment always as Daniel's place, never as our place, never as Clara and Daniel's, just Daniel's. I had noticed all of this. I had cataloged it with the same quiet attention I brought to my work, and then I had set it aside, each time, because the alternative, believing that my mother-in-law was conducting a slow, deliberate campaign against my presence in her son's life, seemed like the kind of thing an anxious, insecure woman would think, and I had not wanted to be that woman. So I had chosen, again and again, to interpret Eleanor's behavior as culture, personality, generation, nothing personal. The choice I had made to maintain my own dignity had, in the end, been the very thing that left me standing in a weed-choked yard holding a bag of weekend clothes while my husband's car disappeared around a bend in the road. The first warning had come in February. 4 months before the trip, Daniel had grown quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness. And I knew the difference, after 6 years, the way you learn to read the specific silences of someone you have slept beside for thousands of nights. His usual quiet was comfortable, self-contained. He was an interior person, and silence for him was simply the natural condition of being alone in his thoughts, which was fine, which I had always respected. This new quiet was different. It was watchful. He would stop a sentence in the middle, glance at his phone, put it face down. He started taking calls in the other room, which he had never done. Once I walked past the bedroom door and heard his voice low and urgent, and then immediately dropping to near silence the moment the floorboard creaked under my foot. When I pushed the door open, he was standing by the window, phone at his side, looking at the street below. He said, "Work stuff." I said, "Okay," and I left. I want to be honest about what I did with that moment because I have turned it over many times since. I chose not to push. I chose to believe him, or at least to behave as though I believed him, which is a different thing. There is a particular calculus that happens inside a long marriage when you encounter something that unsettles you. You measure the cost of confrontation against the cost of silence. And sometimes silence wins, not because you are foolish, but because you are tired, because you have built something and you do not want to crack the foundation with a question you might not want answered. I was tired. I was busy at work in the middle of a large municipal project. I chose silence. I would regret that choice for a long time. In March, Eleanor called me. Not Daniel, me directly on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at my desk. Eleanor never called me directly. In 6 years, she had perhaps phoned me twice, both times to relay a message that could not reach Daniel. The fact of her calling was itself a signal I should have read more carefully. Her voice was soft, unhurried, and warm in the way of someone who is prepared for the conversation in advance. She asked how I was, how work was going, whether Daniel and I had any travel plans coming up. I said nothing specific. She said, "What a shame, you both work so hard, you deserve a break." And then, almost as an afterthought, as though it had just surfaced in her mind rather than being the entire reason for the call, "I've been thinking about Whitmore, about the old house. It's been sitting empty for years. I really should do something about it." Whitmore. I knew the name. She had mentioned it before, the property she had inherited from her own mother, a house in a village 4 hours north, vacant for nearly a decade. She spoke of it always with a carefully performed wistfulness, the way people speak of things they've surrendered to time but haven't truly let go. I had never paid much attention to it because there had seemed nothing to pay attention to. It was her house. It had nothing to do with me. I told her I'd mention it to Daniel. She thanked me warmly and the call ended. 4 minutes total. I hung up and went back to my site plans, and I did not think about that call again until I was standing in front of that house in June, reading my own forged name on a legal document and the full architecture of what had been built around me. Quietly, patiently, over months, finally came into view. The inside of the house smelled of damp plaster, old wood, and something beneath both of those things. A deeper smell, mineral and cold, the smell of a space that had been sealed against the living world for a very long time. I pushed the front door open with my shoulder because the handle was stiff, and it gave with a sound like a slow exhale. The hallway was narrow, papered in a faded pattern of climbing roses that might once have been cheerful and was now the color of old teeth. The floorboards were solid enough underfoot, which surprised me, though several of them groaned in protest at my weight. There was a coat rack by the door with nothing on it, a mirror above it spotted and dim, in which my reflection looked back at me like a woman I didn't quite recognize, hair pulling loose from its tie, dust on my sleeve from where I'd brushed against the door frame, eyes slightly too wide. I looked like someone who had just been told something and hadn't yet decided whether to believe it. I stood in that hallway for probably 3 minutes, doing nothing. This is the strange thing about shock. It doesn't announce itself dramatically, not at first. It settles in slowly, like cold water, and for a while your mind keeps insisting on ordinary things. I need to find a phone signal. I should drink some of the coffee from the thermos. I should sit down. I need to understand what is happening. I walked through the hallway to the kitchen at the back of the house, and that was when I saw the folder. It was sitting in the center of the kitchen table as though it had been placed there intentionally, which of course it had. The table was wooden, scarred with age, and the folder sat on it with the quiet authority of something that had been waiting. My name was on the front. Clara, in blue ink, in the neat, slightly formal handwriting I recognized from 6 years of birthday cards and Christmas notes. Eleanor's handwriting, not Daniel's. The sight of it made the hair on my arms rise in a way that I did not immediately understand. A physical recognition that arrived before the intellectual one. My body knew, before my mind would allow it, that this was wrong. I sat down at the table. I did not open the folder immediately. I sat with my hands flat on my thighs and I looked at it, and I took 3 long breaths the way my mother had taught me when I was young and frightened of something. Then I opened it. The document inside was 4 pages, printed on heavy paper, with a law firm's letterhead at the top, Callaway and Trent Solicitors, and a date in the top right corner, February 14th, Valentine's Day. I noticed this detail with the strange dissociated clarity that comes with shock, the way your mind reaches for small, graspable facts when the large ones are too enormous to hold. February 14th. The day Daniel had brought me breakfast in bed and kissed me on the forehead and said, "You're my favorite person, you know that?" And I had believed him. I had held his face in my hands and believed every word of it. The document was a deed of transfer. It was written in the dense, clause-heavy language of legal instruments, but the meaning was not difficult to extract. It transferred my 50% share in the apartment at 14 Keller Street, the apartment I had put 60,000 pounds of my savings into, the apartment with the balcony and the lavender and the terracotta pots, to Eleanor Rose Marsh, in perpetuity, for a consideration of £1. £1. That was what my share had been valued at, in the document drawn up by Eleanor's solicitors, signed, apparently, by me and witnessed by a name I did not recognize. I turned to the second page. My signature was there, in 3 places, and it was close. It was very close to my real signature. Someone had practiced it, but there was a slight difference in the way the C in Clara curved, a hesitation in the upstroke that wasn't in my hand, and I knew, with the absolute certainty of a person looking at something they have written 10,000 times, that I had never signed this document. My hands had begun to shake at some point during the reading, though I hadn't noticed when it started. I was aware of it now, a fine, continuous tremor running from my fingertips up through my wrists, as though I were very cold, though the kitchen was warm and close and airless. I pressed my palms flat on the table again and held them there, applying pressure, and I looked at the ceiling, water-stained, with a crack running from the light fitting to the far corner, and I breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. In. Out. The crack in the ceiling seemed to pulse slightly, which I understood was my own heartbeat, my blood pressure elevated, the walls of my perception narrowing and brightening the way they do when your body floods itself with the chemicals of threat. What I felt in that moment was not quite anger yet. It was something that existed before anger, a vast white stillness, the way the air goes silent and flat in the seconds before a storm breaks. I thought, Eleanor did this. And then I thought, Daniel drove me here. He knew this was here. He put me in this house and drove away so I would find it alone, 4 hours from the city with no car, no way back, no one to call. He had not forgotten to check the glove compartment. He had not made a mistake. He had been in that car with me for 4 hours, talking about the countryside, about the green of the hills, about how nice it would be to have a quiet few days, while this folder sat on this table, waiting. That was the thing I could not fit inside myself, the 4 hours, the conversation, the deliberateness of it. I found my phone in my jacket pocket and looked at the signal. 1 bar, flickering. I tried to call Daniel. The call connected, rang 4 times, and went to voicemail. His voice warm and familiar. "You've reached Daniel Marsh. Leave a message." I hung up. I tried again. Voicemail. I tried a third time. And on the third attempt, the call didn't even connect. Just a long silence and then a flat tone. He had declined it. He had looked at my name on his screen and pressed the button that sent me into silence. I sat in that kitchen for a long time. The light shifted. A fly moved somewhere near the window. Outside, in the distance, someone was cutting grass. I could hear the mechanical buzz of a mower, small and far away, a sound of ordinary summer life continuing at a great remove from where I sat. I turned the pages of the document over and over in my hands, reading it again, as though repeated reading might change what was on them. It did not. There was a phone number for the solicitor's firm at the bottom of the first page. I took a photo of every page with my phone, then tried to call the number. The call went to an automated message. "Thank you for calling Callaway and Trent. Our offices are currently closed. Our hours are Monday to Friday, 9 to 5:30. It was Saturday. Of course it was Saturday. Daniel had driven me here on a Friday evening and left me here at the start of a weekend during which no solicitor's office, no bank, no legal body of any kind would be reachable. That, too, was not an accident. I eventually found a stronger signal by standing at the far end of the back garden, near what had once been a vegetable patch and was now a tangle of nettles and clover. Standing there in the long evening light, nettles brushing my shins, I called my best friend, Diane. She picked up on the second ring, which is the thing about Diane. She always picks up, which is its own kind of love. I told her what had happened. I heard her go very quiet on the other end, not the quiet of disbelief, but the quiet of a person who is sitting down for what they are about to hear. When I had finished, she said, "Clara, listen to me. Do not touch anything else in that house, and find out how long it takes for a cab to reach you, because I am coming." She drove 3.5 hours through the evening, arriving just before 11 with an overnight bag and a look on her face I had never seen there before. Not pity, but something adjacent to fury, held in careful check because she knew I didn't need her fury right then. I needed hers to be the calm voice so that I could fall apart briefly and then stop falling apart and start thinking. She read the document at the kitchen table while I made tea on a stove that ran on bottled gas. Diane was a contracts manager by profession, and she read legal documents the way I read site plans, efficiently, without sentiment, extracting load-bearing information from the surrounding scaffolding. When she looked up from the last page, her expression was careful. "This is a forgery," she said, not a question, a statement. "Yes," I said. She said, "And Daniel drove you here." "Yes." "And his mother's name is on this as the receiving party." "Yes." She looked back down at the document. Then she said, "There's a clause here you haven't looked at properly." She slid page 3 across the table, pointing to clause 7, B, near the bottom, which stipulated that the transfer was contingent on the permanent vacation of the property by the current co-resident, by me. Meaning, for this transfer to be legally executed, I had to have left the apartment, or be considered to have left it, or be placed somewhere that made it credible to claim I had left voluntarily. I looked at Diane. She looked at me. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. A moth beat itself against the window above the sink. "They needed you out of the apartment," she said quietly. "Physically out. So there's a paper trail that supports the transfer." I thought about Daniel's voice in the car. "You should take some time here." I thought about my bag, already packed when he suggested the trip, as though he had known I would agree. Because I always agreed. because I had loved him, and trust makes you accommodating in ways that are indistinguishable, until they are, from being manageable. He's going to tell someone I left, I said. My voice was very flat, that we'd been having difficulties, that I needed space, that I chose to come here. Diane didn't answer because she didn't need to. I called Daniel again at midnight. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting, not to explain, but to take the temperature of the situation, to hear what I knew and how I sounded. "Clara," he said, "I was going to call you." I said, "I found the folder." Silence. Not the silence of a man caught off guard. The silence of a man selecting the version of himself he had decided to present. "I know this is a shock," he said. "I know it seems there are financial pressures you don't fully understand, and Mom she's had some difficulties, and the property, our property, it was always technically—" "Whose idea was it?" I said. Silence again. "Clara, it's complicated." "Whose idea was it, Daniel?" Not a question. He didn't answer. And in the silence where his answer should have been, I found the last thing I had been reluctant to know. It had been his. I set the phone down on the table and looked at Diane and said, "We need a solicitor, and I need to get back to that apartment before Monday morning." She was already reaching for her phone. And somewhere in the city, in the apartment I had filled with my savings and my lavender and my 6 years of domestic faithfulness, I could only imagine what was being moved, erased, or quietly rearranged while I sat 4 hours away in a house that smelled of old roses and damp stone, in the village where my husband had decided to leave me. He had planned this carefully, meticulously, with a patience I had mistaken for years for kindness. But he had made one mistake, the only mistake that mattered. He had underestimated what I would do when I found out. Diane found a solicitor at midnight. His name was Robert Calder, and he was a property litigation specialist who had the useful quality of answering his emergency line on weekends, a line he maintained, he told us later, specifically because property fraud does not observe business hours. Diane had found his name through a colleague, called the number with an apology for the time, and explained what we had in as few words as possible. He asked 2 questions. Is the document in your physical possession, and are you currently outside the disputed property? I said yes to both. He said, photograph every page, preserve the originals, and do not return to the apartment until you have spoken to me in the morning. He would clear his Sunday. This was not, he said, his first forged transfer. I did not sleep that night. I lay on a dusty mattress in one of the upstairs rooms of the Whitmore house and stared at the ceiling and let myself feel, fully and without management, the enormity of what had happened. There is a kind of grief that has no softness in it, not the grief of loss, which carries its own strange tenderness, but the grief of betrayal, which is dry and hard and has edges like broken glass. I had loved Daniel Marsh for 7 years. I had built a home with him, shared a bed with him, told him things I had never told another person. And he had used that trust as raw material for a plan constructed with his mother over months in secret while he ate dinner across from me and kissed me good morning and told me I was his favorite person. The lie was not in the document. The lie was in every ordinary day that had preceded it. Somewhere around 3 a.m, the grief finished its first pass through me, and what was left was something different. Cleaner, colder. I sat up in the dark and I thought, he has not filed anything yet. The transfer requires my absence from the apartment to be credible. It is Saturday night. The offices don't open until Monday. I have until Monday morning, and I have photographs of a forged document with his mother's solicitor's letterhead and a signature that can be proven by any handwriting expert not to be mine. I thought, I'm not trapped in this village. I was delivered here. Those are not the same thing, and I am leaving. We drove back through the night, Diane and I, the motorway unrolling ahead of us in the dark with that particular nighttime emptiness that makes the world feel reset and provisional, like a cleared table. Diane drove because I asked her to, and I sat in the passenger seat with the folder on my lap, going through the photographs on my phone, making notes. I am a person who organizes under pressure. Not everyone is, I know that, but I am. And that night, the organizing instinct was the thing that saved me, the thing that gave the cold fury somewhere to go. I made a list. The evidence I had, the steps Robert Calder had outlined, the people I needed to contact, the things I needed to retrieve from the apartment before anyone arrived. We reached the city at 4:30 in the morning. The streets were blue-gray and nearly empty, a delivery van at a corner, a couple walking slowly home from somewhere, a traffic light cycling through its colors for no one. I opened the apartment door with my own key, which still worked, which meant they hadn't changed the locks yet, which meant they hadn't anticipated that I would return this quickly. And I stood in the hallway and breathed in the familiar smell of home. The faint trace of the coffee I had made on Friday morning, the lavender from the balcony drifting in through the gap I always left in the sliding door. My home, my 60,000 pounds, my 8 years of savings, my mother's watering can on the balcony ledge. I walked through every room. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been taken. Yet. I gathered what I needed. Bank statements, both our passports, the original mortgage documents, the deed from when we had purchased the apartment, our names, both of them, in black ink on official paper. I photographed everything and uploaded it to a cloud account they did not have access to. Then I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table and waited for morning. Daniel arrived at 9:15. He used his key, which told me he hadn't expected to need to force entry, which told me he had expected to find the apartment empty. He came through the door with the slightly distracted efficiency of a man who has rehearsed a task, and he stopped completely when he saw me sitting at the table with my hands around a mug of tea, looking at him. The color left his face so quickly it was almost interesting to watch. Not a blush, not a flush, but a draining, like water leaving a basin. He stood in the doorway for a long moment with his keys still in his hand. "You came back," he said finally. Not an accusation, not a greeting. The flat statement of a man whose plan has just encountered its first structural failure. "Yes," I said. "Sit down, Daniel." He sat the way people sit when they have lost the authority to remain standing, heavily without choosing his chair, folding into it. He put his keys on the table between us. I looked at them and then at him, and I said, "I've spoken to a solicitor." He closed his eyes. "I have photographs of every page of the document your mother left in that house. I have the originals. My solicitor is filing for an emergency injunction this morning to prevent any transfer of this property, pending an investigation into document fraud." I watched his face as I said this. He did not argue. He did not perform outrage. He simply sat there with his eyes closed, and the silence between us was, as they say, deafening. "Was she going to sell it?" I said. He didn't answer. "Daniel, was she going to sell the apartment?" He said very quietly into the table. "She has debts. She's had debts for years. I didn't know how bad it was until November." and your solution was to give her half of our home." He flinched. "She's my mother." "I know she's your mother," I said, "and I am your wife, and you forged my signature." He said he hadn't forged it himself. He said his mother had arranged the document and he hadn't known about the signature until it was done. He said he had told her it was wrong, that he had tried to stop her, that he had panicked and didn't know how to tell me. He said the trip to Whitmore had been his mother's idea, that she had told him it was just to give them time to work something out, that he hadn't known she was planning to use my absence as evidence of voluntary departure. He said a great many things, in the voice of a man dismantling himself, one apology at a time, and I sat across from him and listened to all of it. And when he had finished, I said, "The day you drove me to that house, knowing the folder was there, that was the day you made your choice. Everything after that is just paperwork." He left. I sat alone in the apartment for a long time after the door closed. Then I picked up my phone and called Robert Calder. Eleanor arrived at 11. She did not ring the bell. She had a key, which Daniel had given her, and she let herself in with the proprietary ease of someone who considers a space already hers. She was wearing a cream blouse and her pearl earrings, and she smelled, as always, of the same lilac perfume she had worn for as long as I had known her. She walked into the kitchen and stopped when she saw me, and behind me, Robert Calder seated at the table with his briefcase open and a notepad in front of him. Whatever she had been expecting, it was not this. Her face went through several calculations very quickly, and what settled onto it was the expression I recognized, the one she used when she needed to reframe a situation to her advantage, the one that preceded phrases like, "I'm only trying to help and we're all family here." "Clara," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you're back. I was worried about you." "Sit down, Eleanor," I said. She looked at Robert. "Who is this?" "My solicitor," I said. She remained standing for another moment, a last gesture of authority, and then sat down. Robert placed a copy of the photographs on the table in front of her without a word. She looked at them. Her expression did not change immediately. She was too practiced for that. But her hand, resting on the table, went very still, and the stillness was its own confession. "I don't know what you think you have here," she said. "A forged deed of transfer," Robert said pleasantly, "bearing your name on the receiving end, the complainant's forged signature, and your solicitor's letterhead, which will be a matter of some interest to Calloway and Trent when we contact them this afternoon." Eleanor looked at me. "Clara," she said, and her voice had shifted, the warmth gone, replaced by the beginning of urgency. "You don't understand the full situation." "I know everything," I said. "I know about the debts. I know you drafted this in February. I know Daniel drove me to Whitmore so you could establish that I had vacated the property. I know all of it, Eleanor, so please, don't tell me what I don't understand." She tried 3 more approaches over the following 20 minutes. Sorrow. Her eyes filled, and she spoke of all she had sacrificed for Daniel over the years, all the years of putting him first, of having no one put her first. Reasonableness. Surely there was a solution that worked for everyone. Surely Clara could see that she was not a criminal, that this was a family matter that had gotten out of hand. And finally, briefly and badly, hostility. If Clara thought she was going to walk away from this family with everything while Eleanor had nothing, Clara had a great deal to learn. That last approach ended when Robert quietly cited the specific statute under which document forgery is prosecuted in this jurisdiction, along with the sentence range, Eleanor's hostility did not survive that citation. What was left when all 3 approaches had failed was something I had never seen on her face before: the expression of a person who has run out of moves. She was 63 years old, and the plan she had spent months constructing had come apart in a kitchen on a Sunday morning, and she looked, for the first and only time in my experience of her, like an old woman. The injunction was filed that afternoon. The police report followed on Monday. Calloway and Trent, when contacted, expressed, in the stiff, formal tones of a firm protecting its professional standing, that the document had been prepared based on instructions provided by Mrs. Marsh as client, and that any irregularities in the execution of signatures had not originated in their office. The solicitor who had handled Eleanor's account resigned within the week. Eleanor's position became untenable quickly, the way these things do when the institutional scaffolding collapses. Without the document, without the transfer, and with a police investigation opened for document fraud, the debts that had motivated the entire plan remained hers to resolve through legitimate means. She remortgaged a smaller property she owned outright. It was painful and expensive and entirely her own doing. Daniel moved out in the 3rd week of July. He called me twice before he did. Once to apologize, once to ask whether there was any possibility of the marriage surviving. The first call I received. The second I let go to voicemail, not from cruelty, but because I had already made my decision, and delivering it over the phone seemed like the wrong register for what needed to be said. I wrote him a letter instead, a short one. I told him that the marriage had not ended when I found the folder. It had ended when he chose, 4 months before that, to participate in a plan designed to dispossess me of my home. The folder was just the evidence. The marriage had ended on Valentine's Day, when he brought me breakfast in bed over a signature that was not mine. The divorce was settled in November. I kept the apartment, the equity, and the lavender on the balcony. Daniel received his share of what remained after the legal costs, which was considerably less than he had imagined and somewhat more than I felt generous about. But I had a good solicitor, and I'd come to understand that fairness and generosity are not the same thing, and that I owed him the former. By the following spring, I had repotted the lavender into larger terracotta containers. The old ones had gotten too small, the roots pressing against the clay. I did this on a Saturday morning in March, the city already beginning its slow lean toward warmth, the light at 9 o'clock still young and horizontal and gentle on the balcony tile. My hands were dirty with soil. My coffee was going cold in the mug on the ledge. Down below, the city was beginning to move. Footsteps on the pavement, a bus, someone's music from an open window 3 floors down. I had a new project at work, a large public garden commission, and I had been thinking about it all week with the particular restless pleasure of a problem you haven't solved yet, but are certain you will. I thought about the Whitmore house sometimes, about the kitchen table, the manila folder, the crack in the ceiling, the moth against the window glass, about standing in the back garden with nettles against my shins, calling Diane, watching the light go amber in the tall weeds. I had been left there to disappear quietly, to become a loose thread neatly snipped. It had not worked, and I found, standing on my balcony in the March light with soil under my fingernails and coffee going cold beside me, that I did not feel triumphant about this. I felt instead something simpler and more durable. I felt like myself, the version of myself that had been too careful for too long, too accommodating, too willing to interpret the world charitably at her own expense. That version had been left behind in Whitmore, in a house that smelled of old roses and long silence. What had come back was something leaner. Something that knew the difference between a foundation and a facade, and had learned, finally, to check which one she was standing on. I pressed the lavender into its new soil and tamped it down firmly with both thumbs. It was going to be a good season for it. I could already tell.